She vanished from the headlines without a trace, until a farmer found her crying by the river, clutching a photo of a boy he barely remembered being. Before we dive in, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment. Where in the world are you watching from? The fog was still rising off the fields when Eli Carter stepped out into the chill. His boots crunched over frost-bitten grass, each breath curling into the pale light like smoke from a tired engine. He hadn't meant to be out this early, but the western fence line had been giving way again, and if he didn't patch it up soon, the neighbors' cattle would start wandering over again. He swung a rusted toolbox into the bed of his truck and headed toward the riverbank, where the land sloped down into bare sycamores and silence. He saw her before she saw him, a woman sitting on the rock ledge where the river narrowed and curved, her shoulders hunched like she was holding back the whole weight of the world. She didn't move as he approached, didn't even flinch when the crunch of gravel under his boots gave him away. Her coat, though expensive-looking, was too thin for this kind of morning. Her long, dark hair was loose and tangled, hiding most of her face, but not enough to cover the tears. She held a photo in her lap. Eli stopped a few feet away, not wanting to startle her. "You all right, ma'am?" The woman looked up slowly, and for a moment the world seemed to hold its breath. Her eyes were red, yes, but steady, deep green with a flash of something behind them, recognition, or maybe just hope where there hadn't been any. She blinked as if she were trying to be sure he was real. "Are you Eli Carter?" He hesitated. "Yeah, that's me." She exhaled, like she'd been holding her breath for years. Then, with trembling fingers, she held up the photo. It was worn, creased, the colors faded, but he recognized it in an instant. Two kids by the river, smiling with muddy feet and jelly-stained shirts. He hadn't seen that photo since the summer they buried a time capsule behind the camp's mess hall. "I've been looking for you," she said, "for a long time." Eli didn't know what to say. Not yet. Not with the river humming low and the wind picking up just enough to blur the edges of everything. But he sat down beside her, and for the first time in years he listened. She didn't speak right away, just held the photo like it was a lifeline, and stared at him like he was something pulled out of memory, half forgotten and suddenly real. Eli shifted on the cold rock, unsure whether to say something or just let the silence stretch. She was still watching him, tears dried, but her expression stuck somewhere between disbelief and something heavier, something closer to relief. Then she said it. "I'm Grace Whitmore." The name hit him like a gust of wind he hadn't braced for. It stirred up old summer heat and childhood echoes of a girl in oversized overalls, always barefoot, always first to dare the rope swing. Grace. He hadn't heard that name in 2 decades, not since Camp Winding River closed, not since they'd filled a mason jar with secrets, promises, and bottle caps, and buried it under a crooked elm tree thinking they'd dig it up someday, but someday never came. Eli looked at her again, really looked, and suddenly he could see it, behind the carefully curated sadness and designer coat. Those same wide eyes, that tilt of her chin when she was trying to look brave. The freckles had faded, and her voice had lost its wild rasp, but it was her. "I thought you moved to Chicago," he said, almost to himself. "I did, and a few other places after that." She gave a faint, tired smile. "Turns out running doesn't really fix much." He let the weight of her name settle in his chest. Grace Whitmore. The Whitmore family was once a dynasty. Real estate, tech, philanthropy. Her face had been on magazine covers. Her father was the kind of man who turned phone calls into empires. And yet, here she was, back in the middle of nowhere, sitting on a cold rock by a muddy river, holding on to a childhood memory like it was the last good thing she had. "I didn't think you'd remember me," she admitted. Eli kept his gaze on the river, then back to her. "You're kind of hard to forget." She smiled again, softer this time, and just like that, the past stopped feeling so far away. Grace held the photo between her fingers like it was something fragile, like even the wind could steal it away if she loosened her grip. Eli leaned in, the early sun breaking through the tree line just enough to cast a golden frame around the image. It was smaller than he remembered, curled at the corners. The ink had faded into soft, almost watercolor edges, but the moment it captured was still alive. Two kids, no older than 9 or 10, stood side by side in the shallows of the winding river, both grinning like they'd just discovered buried treasure. They were soaked from the knees down, their boots caked in mud, and each of them held out a hand, clutching a plastic cup full of tadpoles. Grace was the one on the left, her wild hair tied back with a bandana and her missing front tooth on full display, and on the right, with a backwards cap, scabbed knees, and one arm slung proudly around her shoulder, was him, Eli. "I found it in a box my mom kept," Grace said, voice quiet. "She passed a couple years ago, left me a stack of letters and memories I hadn't looked at in forever. This one was at the bottom." He stared at the photo, a strange ache blooming in his chest. That summer had been the last time things felt light. His mother had been healthy then, his dad was still around, and Grace, she'd been fearless, loud, too smart for her age. He remembered how she used to sneak honey packets from the mess hall and dare him to eat cattail roots. She'd always wanted to save something, whether it was a frog, a hurt bird, or Eli himself. "You kept this all this time, Doug?" he asked. "I think I needed to remember who I was before everything else." Her voice cracked slightly. "Before the company, before the headlines, before I forgot how to breathe." Eli swallowed hard. "You were a good kid, Grace." She looked at him, really looked. "So were you." And for a brief moment, sitting on that riverbank in their grown-up bodies, they were those kids again, muddy, hopeful, and full of wonder for things small enough to fit in a cup. Grace traced the edge of the photo with her thumb, eyes flicking between the image and the river that now ran quiet beside them. The same river, but time had changed everything. The trees were taller, the bank more worn. And yet, sitting beside Eli, it felt like something forgotten had stirred awake. "I don't think I ever said thank you," she murmured. "For what?" Eli asked, glancing over. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she slipped the photo back into her coat pocket and drew her knees up, hugging them like a child trying to stay warm from the inside out. Her voice, when it came, was low, like a secret she'd been carrying for too long. "That summer," she said, "you pulled me out of this river." He blinked, taken aback. "I did? You don't remember?" Pieces flickered, a flash of red from her bandana, the cold current, her scream, his hands grabbing hers just before the water pulled her under. He hadn't thought about it in years. Grace nodded slowly. "I slipped on the rocks near the bend. Everyone else ran for help, but you didn't. You just jumped in. No hesitation." Eli looked out at the bend, now calm and glassy. "I guess I just did what anyone would do." "No," she said, turning to face him. "You did what no one else did. And after that, I never felt that safe again. Not with anyone." The words landed heavier than he expected. For a woman like her, a billionaire, a face on magazine covers, a boardroom shark, safety must have been something wrapped in lawyers and glass towers. Not something simple, not something real. "I thought if I could find you," she continued, voice cracking slightly, "I might be able to find that feeling again, that quiet place, that breath I've been chasing since I left." Eli didn't know what to say, not at first, but he understood that kind of ache, the need to go back, to something before the world hardened around you. "You found the river," he said gently. "That's a start." She smiled at that, small and sad. "Maybe, but I think it's you I was really trying to find." The river flowed steadily beside them, whispering through the reeds as if it too remembered. Not everything was clear, not the names of the other campers, not the counselors, not the exact games they played or which cabin they stayed in, but there were fragments, feelings, fleeting details that stuck in the heart longer than in the mind. Eli glanced at Grace, who now sat with her coat draped tighter around her shoulders, staring into the water like she was listening for something buried in the current. It was strange, how familiar she felt, and yet how distant the years had made them. He barely knew the woman she'd become, but some part of him remembered the girl she was, the fearless, sunburned whirlwind who climbed trees barefoot and swore she'd become president or a firefighter, or maybe both. They'd been kids. Nothing was supposed to last. But here she was, 20 years later, and the space between them didn't feel like absence. It felt like recognition. "Do you remember the mud pit behind the mess hall?" she asked suddenly. He chuckled. "Where you dared me to belly flop for 5 marshmallows?" Her laugh was real, bright and sudden, like a burst of summer heat cutting through the cold. "You did it, got stuck halfway, and screamed like a wildcat." "You pushed me out with a canoe paddle, Paul," he said, smiling at the memory. "Then took 2 of the marshmallows for yourself." She smirked. "Interest. I charged interest." Eli shook his head, but the laugh lingered. It felt good, like a stretch after a long sleep, like remembering you were once capable of joy. "I don't know how it's possible," she said softly, "but sitting here, it doesn't feel like 20 years passed." He nodded, staring at the faint ripples. "It's like we skipped the in-between." She looked over, her eyes holding something he couldn't name. "Do you think it means anything? That I found you? That you're still here?" Eli met her gaze and didn't look away. "I think some things come back when they're meant to." She didn't respond, but she didn't have to, because in that moment, 2 strangers carrying a shared past, they both knew something old had returned, and neither of them wanted it to leave again. The wind picked up, sending a shiver through the trees and rustling the dry grass at their feet. Grace pulled her knees closer, as if bracing herself for something colder than the air. Eli sat beside her in silence, sensing the shift. Not just in temperature, but in her, like something was building behind her eyes, pressing against her ribcage, waiting for permission to be released. She exhaled slowly. "I walked away from everything." Eli turned to her, his brow tightening. "What do you mean?" She didn't look at him. Instead, she stared out over the water, fingers absently playing with a loose thread on her sleeve. 2 weeks ago, I was supposed to be in London, closing the biggest deal of my life, a merger, global, the kind of thing that cements your name in history. He waited, letting the space fill. Instead, I left the hotel at midnight, booked a flight with no luggage, landed back in the States with no plan, just this photo and a memory of a boy who once pulled me out of a river. Eli blinked. "You left all of that for me?" She smiled faintly. "Not just for you, for the part of me that only existed when I was around you, that summer. It's the last time I remember feeling unafraid." The words hung between them like breath in the cold. She wasn't talking about corporate fear, not deadlines or stock prices. She meant the other kind, the slow kind, the kind that eats you when success becomes a mask and everyone around you wants something. "My board thinks I'm having a breakdown," she said. "My assistant is fielding media inquiries. My fiancé, ex, I guess, left 3 voicemails, all asking the same thing." She turned to Eli, her eyes clear now, steady. "Why would a woman who has everything leave it all behind?" He swallowed, unsure what to say. Grace answered for him. "Because none of it meant anything, not compared to one moment of real kindness, and you gave me that." He didn't know whether to speak or reach for her or just let the weight of her confession settle between them. So he did what he knew how to do best. He stayed, quiet, present, and that, more than any answer, was exactly what she needed. Eli stood at the edge of the field later that afternoon, hands resting on the top rail of the old fence, watching the wind ripple through rows of brittle corn stalks that should have stood tall but sagged like tired shoulders. The soil was dry, drier than it had ever been this early in the season, the kind of dry that cracked beneath your boots and whispered warnings in every step. He didn't hear Grace approach until her boots crunched against the gravel path behind him. "Your land's beautiful," she said gently, eyes scanning the horizon. He nodded once, not looking at her. "Used to be greener." The silence that followed was heavy but not awkward. She didn't push, didn't ask questions, and for that he was grateful. Because what could he say? That the rains had come too late, the loans too high, the markets too cruel, that he'd stopped opening mail with his name on it because he already knew what was inside. She walked a few paces forward, stopping at the fence beside him. "Do you ever think about leaving, starting over somewhere else?" He let out a quiet laugh, more exhale than humor. "This land's been in my family since before electricity hit the valley. I think if I left, the ghosts would chase me down." She smiled at that, but didn't press. Eli could feel her eyes on him, waiting, not for an explanation, just honesty. But he didn't offer any. Because she didn't need to know the bank's last warning had come 2 weeks ago. That his tractor was running on borrowed parts and borrowed time. That he hadn't filled his own fridge in days because every extra dollar went to feed the animals first. She didn't need to see the cracks in the barn's foundation or the worry lines beneath his smile. No, Grace didn't come looking for a broken man. She came searching for a boy who once saved her. And for now, he wanted to be that boy, whole, steady. So he turned to her and said, "It's just a rough patch. Happens sometimes." She nodded, accepting the half-truth like a gift. And he looked out over the land again, hoping the sky might still change, hoping the rain might still come. By the time the sun dipped below the tree line, the chill had crept back in, curling around the barn like smoke off the river. Eli finished tossing hay into the last stall, his shoulders sore and hands raw from the day's labor. Grace stood by the fence, quiet, still in that too-thin coat, watching him like she hadn't done anything else all day, not intruding, not offering to help, just being there, like presence was enough. He wiped his hands on his jeans and nodded toward the dirt path that curved behind the barn. "You hungry?" She looked surprised. "A little, yeah." "Come on," he said, walking toward the house. "Guest house has heat, hot water, and a fridge that hums like a dying cat, but it'll do." Grace blinked. "You're offering me a place to stay?" He didn't slow his pace. "Well, you said you didn't have a plan. Can't have you freezing out by the river every night." She caught up to him, matching his steps. "Eli, I can pay. I didn't come here broke." "I know." Then he stopped in front of the guest house door, keys already in hand. The porch light flickered like it wasn't sure it wanted to stay on. "Look, I was raised on a simple rule. If someone's lost and you can offer them shelter, you do. Doesn't matter who they are or how much they've got in their bank account. Doesn't even matter if they're only staying for a night." Grace stared at him, the lines of her face softening. "That sounds like something from a movie." He shrugged. "It's just farm life. You take care of people when you can, even if everything around you's falling apart." She didn't say anything for a moment. Then, quietly, "Thank you." He unlocked the door and pushed it open. The room was small, plain wood floors, mismatched furniture, a worn quilt on the bed, but warm, safe. "Make yourself at home," he said, turning back toward the barn. "I'll holler when supper's ready." Grace stepped inside, the door clicking shut behind her, and for the first time in a long time she felt what she'd been searching for all along. Not comfort, not escape, kindness. Grace wasn't sure what time Eli woke up, only that by the time she stepped outside in the mornings, the air was already thick with the scent of hay and earth and coffee from a battered thermos that never left his hand. She'd never been an early riser, but something about the rhythm of the farm, honest, unpretending, made her want to try. The first morning, she borrowed an old pair of boots from the porch and nearly tripped into a wheelbarrow full of feed. Eli didn't laugh. He just handed her a rake and said, "Start wide, move slow." By the third morning, she'd learned how to carry water buckets without spilling, how to whistle for the goats, and how to keep the rooster from thinking she was a threat. Buttercup, the bossiest of the bunch, had taken a liking to her, nipping at her coat if she moved too slow and bleating dramatically if she forgot to greet her first. Grace wasn't built for this kind of life, not on paper. Her hands were soft, her nails still recovering from years of boardrooms and blowouts, but she liked the blisters. They felt honest. Every time her muscles ached, every time mud clung to the hem of her borrowed jeans, she felt a little more like the girl in the photo again. Sometimes, when they worked in silence, she'd catch Eli looking at her, not with confusion or pity, but with something gentler, like he was watching a ghost step back into its body, like he saw her before she even remembered who she used to be. One morning, while mending a chicken wire fence, Grace paused and stared out at the woods. "Do you remember the tree we carved our names into?" Eli looked up from the fence line. "The one near the old canoe shed?" She nodded. "I wonder if it's still there." He set down his pliers. "Only one way to find out?" She smiled, not because she was sure it was, but because for the first time in years she wanted to remember. Not as the woman she became in the headlines, but as the girl who once danced barefoot on mossy river stones and laughed with a boy who made her feel like home. And every step she took in those two big boots was another step back toward her own forgotten truth. They sat on the porch that night after dinner, the stars sharp against the black velvet sky, and the sound of crickets blending into the occasional low bellow from the barn. Eli had made chili, simple, hearty, the kind that warmed your bones more than your stomach. Grace ate in silence, her bowl empty long before she spoke. "I used to think I was brave," she said quietly, knees pulled to her chest. "But looking back, I've spent most of my life running." Eli didn't say anything, just sipped from his mug and waited. Grace leaned her head back against the wooden beam behind her. "My father built an empire on charm and ruthless deals. He smiled for the cameras and gutted rivals behind closed doors. And I became the perfect daughter, Ivy League, fluent in 3 languages, the youngest exec in the company's history, but every choice I made had his fingerprints on it." Her voice didn't tremble, but it had weight, like every syllable was carved out of stone. "People see me now and think I'm powerful. They don't see the meetings where I couldn't speak without approval, the fake engagement to a man I didn't love because our families needed a merger, not a marriage, the charity galas, the magazine covers, all theater, a legacy built on performance." Eli glanced at her, his eyes steady, unreadable. "So what changed?" She took a deep breath, the night air catching in her lungs. "A little boy drowned last year in one of our developments. We covered it up. Legally, everything was airtight, but I sat across from his mother during a settlement meeting and she looked at me like I was nothing. And for the first time, I believed her." The silence that followed was heavier than any words. "I left the office that night," she continued, "and didn't go back. Sold my stock, cut ties, ran." Eli leaned forward, elbows on his knees. "And ended up here." She nodded. "I didn't know what I was looking for. I just knew I wanted something real, something kind, something like—" Her voice trailed off. Eli didn't fill the silence. He just offered it, unjudging, unafraid. And in that silence, Grace didn't feel like the girl who ran. She felt like the woman who had finally stopped. The porch had gone quiet again, save for the low hum of cicadas and the occasional creak of wood settling into the night. Grace hugged her knees a little tighter, eyes tracing constellations she hadn't tried to name in years. Eli sat beside her, one boot resting on the step below, fingers gently drumming on his coffee mug. She turned to him after a long silence. "You never left this place, did you?" He shook his head slowly. "Didn't have much of a choice." She waited, sensing there was more, something unsaid but carried in his posture, in the way his shoulders never quite relaxed, even at rest. "My mom got sick the summer after you left camp," he said, eyes still on the darkness ahead. "Lung cancer. She didn't smoke, didn't drink, just got unlucky." Grace didn't interrupt. She knew the sound of a story rising up from somewhere long buried. "Dad didn't stick around long after her diagnosis," he added, his voice quiet. "Said he couldn't watch her fade. I guess he figured we were better off without him." Her breath caught. "So it was just you?" "Me and her," he nodded. "I was 14, took over the chores, learned to patch fences, figured out how to keep the animals fed without messing it up too bad. Learned fast, or we wouldn't have made it." Grace looked at him like she was seeing him again for the first time. Not the man who ran a quiet, stubborn farm, but the boy who never got the chance to run. The one who stayed because someone had to. Because love meant doing the hard things when no one else would. "She passed 3 years later," he said. "By then I knew this land better than I knew myself. I stayed because it felt like, if I left, everything she worked for would just disappear." Grace reached over, her fingers brushing his. He didn't move, just sat there, solid and still, the way he always had been. "You were always brave," she whispered. He looked at her, eyes softer than she expected. "I wasn't brave, Grace. I just didn't run." And in that moment, the girl who ran and the boy who stayed understood each other completely. The storm rolled in fast. One minute, the evening sky was bruised with distant clouds. The next, it cracked open with a roar that shook the windows. Rain slammed against the tin roof like 1,000 fists, wind howling through the trees with a kind of desperation Grace hadn't heard in years. She stood in the guest house doorway, arms wrapped around herself, watching the yard disappear beneath sheets of rain. The lights flickered once, twice, and then the world went dark. She waited a beat, then another. No hum of the fridge, no soft buzz of the old heater, just the wild, pulsing rhythm of the storm outside. And then, faint through the blackness, she saw a glow. A single, flickering light, moving through the dark like a firefly. Grace grabbed her coat and slipped outside, boots splashing through the mud as she followed the amber glow to the barn. She found him there, Eli, standing near the feed bins, holding an old lantern high above his head. The glass was fogged, the metal dented and scratched, but the flame inside burned steady. Its light spilled across his face, catching the edges of his jaw and the shadows beneath his eyes. She froze in the doorway, half soaked, half in awe. "Is that—" He looked over, and for the first time in hours, smiled. "Same one we used to sneak out with at camp." She stepped inside, letting the warmth of the light hit her skin. "You kept it?" "Found it in the attic after my mom passed," he said. "Still works. Barely." The wind shrieked outside, but inside the barn it was calm. The animals rustled nervously in their stalls, but Eli moved among them with quiet certainty, checking latches, tossing feed, lighting a second lantern for the far end. Grace took one from his hand. "What do you need?" He raised an eyebrow. "You sure?" "I'm not much for running anymore," she said, her voice steady. Together they moved through the barn, lighting corners and steadying nerves, animal and human alike. The storm raged on, but within those walls, by the soft glow of a childhood lantern, they found something neither of them had felt in years: safety and each other. The barn had gone quiet, not silent, never truly silent on a farm, but settled. The wind had calmed, the thunder moved on, and the rain now tapped gently against the roof like it was tired from all its fury. The animals had quieted, their nervous pacing replaced by soft breathing and the occasional content shuffle. Grace stood near the far stall, arms wrapped tight around herself, her coat clinging to her skin. Her hair was wet, sticking to her face in messy strands. Eli had just finished securing the last gate when he turned and saw her like that, drenched, exhausted, but still standing there like she didn't want to leave, like the storm wasn't over for her yet. She looked up at him, blinking slowly. "I haven't felt this human in a long time." He took a step toward her, not speaking. He didn't know what to say to that. Maybe there was nothing to say. And then she was moving. She crossed the barn floor without hesitation, boots squishing through the wet hay, and wrapped her arms around him. Not tentative, not polite, just real, like gravity, like memory. For a second he didn't move. He hadn't been held like that in years, not since before his mother passed, not since his world had become measured in chores and invoices and silence. He was a man who fixed broken fences and held the line when no one else could, but now someone was holding him, and that broke something open. His arms came around her slowly, one hand resting between her shoulder blades, the other against her damp hair. She was cold, trembling, but she didn't let go. Neither did he. They stood like that for a long time, the storm easing around them, the lantern flickering nearby. There was no rush, no urgency, just warmth in the midst of cold, and a kind of closeness that had nothing to prove. When she finally pulled back, she didn't say anything, just looked up at him, rain still clinging to her lashes. And in that look, Eli felt something he hadn't dared feel in years. Alive, seen, worth staying for. The next morning broke slower than usual, with heavy clouds lingering low over the fields and a strange stillness in the air. Eli had just finished feeding the chickens when he heard the crunch of tires on gravel, not the slow, familiar rumble of a neighbor's truck, but something smoother, heavier. Out of place. He stepped onto the porch just as the black car came to a stop at the edge of the driveway. Sleek, polished. Windows too dark for a friendly visit. The door opened and a man stepped out wearing a suit that didn't belong anywhere near mud. Tall, angular, expensive. The kind of man who smelled like boardrooms and power lunches. "Eli Carter?" he asked, adjusting his coat like the air offended him. Eli didn't answer right away, just crossed his arms and waited. The man glanced toward the guest house. "She's here, isn't she?" Eli didn't blink. "Who's asking?" The man smiled, but it didn't reach his eyes. "Nathan Carrington. Grace and I were engaged until she decided to vanish into the woods and relive her summer camp fantasies." Eli's jaw tightened. "You drove all this way just to insult her?" Nathan chuckled. "No, I came to make you an offer." He pulled a checkbook from his coat and scribbled something quickly, ripping it free with the ease of someone who didn't worry about numbers. He handed it to Eli, who took it without looking down. "I know what this place is worth. That's double, maybe triple. Enough to fix every broken thing on this land and still have money left over. All I ask is that you convince her to come back." Eli finally looked at the check. The amount was enough to wipe out every debt, every sleepless night. He could save the farm, rebuild the barn, maybe even buy his mother's piano back from the estate sale it ended up in. It was more than tempting. It was life-changing. But he looked up, past Nathan, toward the guest house window where Grace now stood, watching. And in that moment, Eli knew the answer. He folded the check once, then again, and tucked it neatly into Nathan's coat pocket. "She's not a deal, and I'm not for sale." Nathan's smirk wavered. Eli turned away, boots crunching on gravel. "You can see yourself out." Nathan didn't move. He stood there in his overpriced shoes, stunned, like he couldn't quite process what just happened. Men like him weren't used to hearing no, especially not from men with dirt under their fingernails and mortgages hanging over their heads. Eli didn't care. He walked back toward the barn, heart pounding with a quiet fury, the crisp edge of the check still in his hand. Grace was still at the window, motionless, but he didn't meet her eyes. Not yet. Nathan followed, of course. "You're making a mistake," he called out, stepping through the mud like it offended him. "Do you have any idea what that check could do for you?" Eli stopped. He turned slowly, held the check up between his fingers, and without a word, ripped it clean down the middle, then again and again, until nothing was left but fluttering pieces that fell like confetti into the wet earth. "She's not a deal," Eli said, voice even. "She's a person." Nathan's face hardened. "You think this little act makes you noble? You're a farmer, Carter. You fix things with rusted tools and duct tape. She lives in a world of global press conferences and private jets. You think this is real?" Eli stepped forward, calm and solid. "I think what's real is how she laughs when she's mucking stalls, how she talks to the goats like they're old friends, how she stayed out in a thunderstorm just to make sure the animals were calm." Nathan blinked. Eli didn't stop. She's here because she's trying to remember who she was before people like you told her who to be. And I'm not about to hand her back to the world that broke her. Nathan opened his mouth, but no words came. Eli's eyes didn't waver. So take your check, take your suit, and take your exit. Nathan stood there for a moment longer, jaw clenched, rain beginning to fall again in soft drizzles across his shoulders. Then, without another word, he turned and walked back to the car. Eli stood in the silence that followed, watching the taillights disappear down the gravel road. Behind him, the guest house door creaked open, but he didn't turn, not yet. He just stood there, letting the pieces of the check melt into the mud, where they belonged. The rain had passed by evening, leaving behind a damp hush that settled over the fields like a breath held too long. The air smelled of cedar and earth and something sweet Grace couldn't quite place, maybe nostalgia. She'd spent the afternoon cleaning out the loft above the barn, tossing aside old feed bags and shooing away a stubborn raccoon. But what she hadn't expected to find, tucked behind a tarp and a dusty box of Christmas lights, was the old radio. It was dented, faded, the tuning knob missing, but it still worked. Sort of. When she twisted the broken dial with the edge of a key, it crackled to life, spitting static, before finally landing on a station that played soft old country songs. The kind her mother used to hum in the kitchen, the kind she hadn't listened to since before her name meant anything to the outside world. She strung the lights across the rafters, balancing on a rickety ladder and half laughing at the absurdity of it. But by the time the sun dipped below the hills, the loft glowed with a soft amber hue, like magic spun from nothing. She found Eli in the barn below, sweeping sawdust into neat little piles. "Come upstairs," she called, leaning over the edge. "You've got to see this." He looked up, wary. "Why do I feel like I'm walking into a trap?" She smiled. "Because you are, but a good one." When he reached the top of the ladder, he paused. The lights, the radio, the faint music curling through the air like a memory. He raised an eyebrow. "You did all this?" She nodded. "Figured this barn could use a little charm." He looked around again, then back at her. "It's definitely something." Grace stepped forward, holding out her hand. "Dance with me." He hesitated, then took it. At first they stumbled. Eli's hands were too unsure, Grace's rhythm too polished. But then something shifted. His hand settled on her waist like it belonged there. She leaned into his chest like she'd been there before. They moved slowly, boots brushing hay, laughter folding into something quieter, closer, more real. And as the radio played on, just a little off-key, they danced in a barn full of ghosts and twinkling lights, like they were the only two people in the world. And maybe, just maybe, they were. The next morning was gentle, the kind that made you move slow without guilt. Fog hung low over the fields, and the dew clung thick to the grass as the sun stretched itself awake. Eli didn't say much over breakfast, just handed Grace a thermos of coffee and pointed toward the eastern ridge with a nod. She followed him without question. They walked through the orchard and across the back pasture where the trees grew denser and the world felt quieter. The trail narrowed into a footpath lined with moss and memory. Finally, they reached a small clearing, and there it stood, weathered, crooked, and still standing. A treehouse. It was perched in the crook of two thick oaks, the wood faded to gray, the rope ladder worn but strong. Grace tilted her head, caught somewhere between surprise and something deeper. "You built this?" she asked. Eli nodded. "Took me 2 summers and more splinters than I'll admit." She looked up at it, then back at him. "For who?" He hesitated. "Emily, my little sister." The name dropped gently, but the weight behind it hung in the air. "She passed when she was 10, Eli continued, voice steady but distant. "Car accident. I was 16. She used to say she wanted a place where no one could tell her to be quiet. So I built her this. It was supposed to be her hideout, her library, her castle. After she was gone, I just kept fixing it. Grace stared at the treehouse, heart tightening. You come here often? Not as much as I used to, he said. But when things get too loud, yeah. He motioned toward the ladder. Want to see it? She nodded. Climbing up, the air changed. The little room was lined with old books, a blanket folded neatly in the corner, and a tiny notebook on a wooden shelf labeled Emily's Secrets. Dust clung to everything, but so did love. Not loud, not broken, just still. Grace sat in the corner, running her fingers along the windowsill. It's beautiful, Eli. He leaned against the frame, eyes distant. It's the only place I ever let myself be a kid again. And as Grace looked around, she didn't see a forgotten fort. She saw a boy who'd carried grief in silence, who turned heartbreak into shelter, and for the first time, she realized just how much of Eli's soul was made of the things he'd built for others. It started with a sighting at Miller's feed store. Grace in worn jeans and a faded flannel, holding a bag of chicken feed like it wasn't heavier than her entire briefcase from a year ago. Mrs. Dupree, who'd run the register since the Reagan era, caught her name on the receipt and nearly forgot to give back her change. By the time Grace made it to the parking lot, someone was already on the phone with someone else's sister. Within 24 hours, the whispers moved faster than wildfire on a dry August field. That billionaire girl's back in town, Whitmore. She bought the feed herself? No driver, no heels, just boots and a ponytail. She's staying at Eli Carter's place. At Rosie's diner, the lunch crowd buzzed louder than the ceiling fan. People peered over coffee cups and murmured behind pie menus. A few tried to act casual as they brought up her name. Most didn't bother pretending. She could be anywhere in the world. Why is she in a town with one gas station and no Starbucks? Maybe she's having a breakdown. Maybe she's finally come to her senses. At first, Grace didn't notice the shift. She was too focused on learning how to muck stalls without gagging, how to drive Eli's rattling truck into town without stalling it, how to live without her name meaning something at every corner. But by the third day, she felt it, the stares, the slowed conversations when she walked into a room. People watching her like she was both a returning ghost and a local scandal. She asked Eli about it while they were stacking hay bales behind the barn. He shrugged. Small town. You leave as a girl with pigtails and come back on magazine covers, people are going to talk. And because I'm staying with you? That too. Grace leaned on the hay bale, brushing straw from her sleeves. Does it bother you? He glanced at her, then back at the stack. I don't live for their opinions. She smiled, but it didn't quite reach her eyes. I used to. Eli didn't respond, just lifted another bale. And for the first time, Grace realized how freeing it must be to live in a world where your worth wasn't decided by headlines, but by the way you showed up in everyday silence. And the man who held that silence like it was sacred. The Maplewood Harvest Festival hadn't changed in decades. Same hand-painted signs, same hay bales lining the town square, same fiddler trio, playing under the gazebo like they were born with bows in their hands. Kids darted between booths with sticky fingers and caramel-stained cheeks, and the smell of cinnamon, wood smoke, and fried dough wrapped around everything like a familiar quilt. Eli hadn't planned on going. He never did. But that morning Grace had knocked on the barn door, holding 2 mugs of cider and a crooked smile. We're going, she'd declared. You've avoided fun long enough. So here they were. Her in a borrowed flannel and jeans that actually fit this time, him in his worn boots, and the same jacket he wore every year, like a talisman against change. The town's eyes followed her, of course, some subtle, some not. But Grace didn't flinch. Instead, she threw herself into the chaos with the energy of someone reclaiming lost time. She ended up behind the pie stand by accident, after the mayor's niece fainted from heat and someone shoved a rolling pin in her hands. She's a natural, one woman whispered. She just sold 3 blueberry pies to a man who doesn't even like fruit, another added. Eli watched from a distance, leaning against a fence post, arms crossed, trying not to smile. But when she caught his eye and held up two fingers, one for him, one for her, he walked over, knowing resistance was futile. They shared slices on a hay bale near the auction stage, sticky with whipped cream and laughter, when the MC called out the next lot. 1-year-old dwarf goat, female, named Buttercup, starting at 50. Grace perked up. A goat? Eli raised an eyebrow. We don't need another one. But she's adorable, Grace said, eyes locked on the tiny, defiant ball of fluff chewing on the auctioneer's pants cuff. Before Eli could protest, her hand shot up. 70. The crowd turned. The murmurs returned. 80. Someone else offered. 90, Grace shot back without blinking. Sold. Eli looked at her, half amused, half exasperated. You just bought a goat. She looked like she needed a new beginning, Grace said, popping the last bite of pie into her mouth. He shook his head, but the warmth in his chest betrayed him. And that night, Buttercup slept in the barn. So did the laughter, and maybe something else too, something that felt a lot like home. The call came just after dawn, when the sky was still painted in soft grays, and the rooster hadn't yet decided to ruin the peace. Grace was sitting on the porch swing, with a blanket over her lap and Buttercup at her feet, chewing on the corner of yesterday's newspaper. Eli had gone into town early to grab feed, trusting her to keep an eye on the new goat, and for once she felt like she belonged to the stillness. Her phone buzzed on the porch railing, an unfamiliar number from a familiar area code. New York. She hesitated, staring at it like it might bite. Then, with a sigh, she picked up. Grace, a breathless voice pleaded on the other end. Thank God! It was Marcy, her assistant for the last 5 years. Loyal, efficient, the kind of woman who could find a missing CEO and a dry cleaner on Christmas Eve. Marcy, Grace said quietly, I've been calling you for 3 days. The board's in meltdown. Investors are panicking. The media is speculating everything from a health scare to an international elopement. You need to come back. Grace rubbed her temple. I left a statement. I resigned. I was clear. Well, the board didn't think you meant it, and now that they realize you did, they're scrambling. Last night they called an emergency session. There's talk of a hostile takeover, Grace. If you don't return, they'll dissolve the founding shares clause. They're voting tomorrow. Grace closed her eyes. The porch creaked beneath her, the early wind brushing against her skin like a whisper from a life she'd tried to bury. Buttercup bleated softly, nuzzling her boot like she could sense the shift. I'm not going back, Grace said, more to herself than to Marcy. You built this company, Marcy snapped, panic sharpening her voice. They're going to rip it apart without you. Grace opened her eyes, the horizon now glowing gold behind the hills. She looked out at the fields, the barn, the swing she hadn't realized she was swaying on. Everything quiet, everything real. I didn't come here to run, she said gently. I came here to remember. Then she hung up, and let the stillness take her back. The sun had long slipped behind the ridge, leaving only streaks of amber and violet stretched across the sky like a closing curtain. The barn was quiet now, animals fed, stalls clean, tools hung on their nails, with the kind of precise care Eli never called pride, but lived like religion. Grace stood near the feed bins, arms crossed lightly, watching as he adjusted the last latch on the stable door. Neither of them had said much all evening. The call from New York still lingered in the air like dust stirred up and left to settle. Grace hadn't brought it up. Eli hadn't asked. But the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was waiting. Outside, the wind rustled the fields. Inside, everything was still but their breathing. She took a slow step forward. You always work this late? He didn't look at her right away. When there's work to do. She smiled faintly. And when there isn't? He finally met her eyes. Then, I still do. A quiet laugh slipped from her. You don't let many people in, do you? He shrugged. Most don't stay long enough to bother. I'm still here. He took a step closer. and something shifted in the air between them. Subtle, certain. Not a surge, but a pull, like gravity remembering what it's meant to hold. "You're not like most," he said. She searched his face, her voice just above a whisper. "Why haven't you kissed me yet?" His jaw tightened, not with hesitation, but with everything he'd been holding back, because once I do, I won't want to stop. Grace didn't flinch, didn't move. So he did. He closed the space between them slowly, one hand brushing the side of her face, rough fingers catching in her hair. And when he kissed her, soft, sure, without apology, it wasn't the kind of kiss you give to see what might happen. It was the kind you give when you already know. She didn't pull away. She leaned in. And in that quiet, after the storm, and before whatever came next, the barn held their secret. Wrapped in wood and hay and breathless hearts, something had changed, and neither of them would be able to go back. The sky hadn't even turned gray when Grace stood in the doorway of the guest house, backpack slung over one shoulder, boots laced tight. The farm was still sleeping, no roosters, no creaking wind, no voices. Just the soft, hollow stillness of a morning too early to name. She had written the note twice. The first time it was too long, the second time it was just right. "Eli, I had to go back, not because I wanted to, but because I need to finish what I started. You gave me the strength to remember who I am. I'll come back, if I still belong here. Thank you for the river, for the quiet, for not asking me to stay. G." She folded the note and left it on the kitchen table, weighted by a mason jar of wildflowers she'd picked from the edge of the property the morning after the kiss. Buttercup bleated once from the barn as she walked past. Grace paused, hand on the gate, eyes lifting to the roofline she'd memorized in such a short time. She could still feel the warmth of Eli's hands from the night before, the softness in the way he looked at her afterward, like he knew something had changed but didn't dare name it yet. She wasn't leaving to run, not this time. She was leaving to fight. The car, a rental Eli didn't know she'd arranged, waited just past the main road. No lights, no noise, just a driver half asleep behind the wheel, probably wondering why anyone would choose to leave a place like this. Grace didn't cry. She'd done enough of that before she even arrived here. But when she climbed into the back seat and watched the outline of the barn fade into mist, something inside her pulled, like a thread unspooling slowly, stretching between the life she'd chosen and the one she'd finally found. She whispered, "I'm coming back," not for the driver, not for herself, but for the man still asleep, who wouldn't find her note until the coffee was brewed and the day had already begun. And when he did, the only thing she hoped was that he'd understand. The morning passed in fragments, chores half done, coffee gone cold. Eli had looked everywhere, barn, porch, truck, even the orchard, but the guest house was empty, her boots gone from beside the door, her coat missing from the hook. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore, it was loud, hollow, final. He found her note just after sunrise, sitting on the kitchen table like it had always belonged there. The handwriting was careful, like each word had been weighed before it landed. His name at the top. No apologies, no promises, just truth. Eli read it once, then again, and then he went to the river. The trail was soft from the recent rain, the path still marked faintly by her boots from the last time they'd walked it together. He followed it in silence, the weight of memory settling on his shoulders like the old quilt his mother used to lay out for summer picnics. When he reached the bend, the same one where he'd found her that first morning, he stopped. The spot was empty, but not untouched. On the flat rock where she had once sat, there was something new. A single photograph, creased, worn, and familiar. The picture from camp. 2 kids in muddy boots, holding cups of tadpoles, wide-eyed and unguarded. His arm around her shoulders, her smile like it didn't know how to fade. Beneath it, a folded piece of paper tucked under a smooth river stone. He opened it slowly, the paper damp at the corners, her handwriting the same careful lines as before. "Don't let go of who you are." That was all. He stood there a long time, holding the photo in one hand, the note in the other, the breeze teasing the edge of both. The river moved past him, quiet and steady, like it always had, but something in him shifted. She hadn't left to disappear. She'd left to remember, and she wanted him to do the same. He folded the photo and the note together and slipped them into the chest pocket of his shirt, right over his heart. Then he sat on the rock facing the water and didn't speak. Because some goodbyes don't need words, and some love stories don't end when someone leaves. The harvest came late that year, dragging its heels through the dust like it, too, was reluctant to let go. The fields didn't wait, though. Corn browned. Hay needed cutting. Apples clung stubbornly to the trees, ripening under skies that now felt just a little too wide, a little too quiet. Eli worked from sunup to sundown alone, not because he wanted to be, but because she wasn't there. Grace had left before the first frost, but her presence hadn't. He heard her laughter in the barn rafters, where the string lights still hung in soft loops. He saw her in the boot prints that had long since faded from the trail to the river. And when the wind caught just right, he swore he could still smell that vanilla soap she kept by the guest house sink. He didn't talk about her, not to the neighbors, not to the mailman who'd started asking questions, not even to Buttercup, who now followed him around the farm like a four-legged shadow. But he felt her, in the way the porch swing rocked on windless afternoons, in the quiet between chores, where her voice used to fill the air with questions that didn't always need answers, in the silence after the kiss that still lived just under his skin. He finished the harvest by hand, like always, stacked the hay, picked the last apples himself, hauled the corn to Miller's with the same care he used when she rode beside him, laughing at how much the truck rattled. Some days he'd catch himself looking over his shoulder, half expecting to see her, hair tied back, boots too clean, sleeves rolled up with that grin that always meant trouble. But there was only wind and sun and the steady rhythm of his work. He told himself it was enough, that the land still needed him, that the animals still depended on him, that maybe if he just kept moving, the ache would settle into something manageable. But every morning, when the light touched the river first and the barn door creaked open to a world missing something unnamed, Eli knew the truth. He wasn't just harvesting crops. He was carrying a season without her. It started with a blurry photo. Someone at the harvest festival had snapped it. Grace, laughing behind the pie stand, apron smeared with cherry filling, her hair pulled into a messy braid, a goat nipping at her elbow. They hadn't even realized who she was until weeks later, when the pieces clicked. And then, like fire through dry fields, the story spread. A reporter from a mid-tier lifestyle magazine picked up the lead, a puff piece at first. Billionaire heiress spotted at rural festival, new life, new love. No one expected it to stick, but then came the follow-up, deeper, sharper, investigative. Grace Whitmore vanishes from boardroom, found working on struggling farm. They dug, compared timelines, cross-referenced grainy social posts and small-town whispers. A grocery clerk mentioned seeing her buy canned beans and dog food. A school teacher claimed she'd asked about volunteer tutoring. Then someone found the land deed and linked it to Eli Carter, a man who didn't own a suit, whose farm had been one late payment from foreclosure. And suddenly, the world had a narrative it couldn't resist. The article went live at midnight. By sunrise, it was everywhere. Grace's name trended again for the first time since her resignation, but this time it wasn't about mergers or scandals. It was about love, or at least the media's version of it. Heiress escapes corporate cage, finds solace in arms of humble farmer. From skyscrapers to silos, the woman who gave it all up. Runaway CEO or modern-day Cinderella. Eli found out when his phone wouldn't stop buzzing. His mailbox overflowed with interview requests, talk show invites, even a book agent. Reporters showed up at the edge of his property, cameras ready, trying to catch the man who had somehow become America's favorite fairy tale farmer. But Eli didn't speak, not to any of them. He kept working, kept feeding the animals, kept sitting on the porch every night when the sky turned orange, holding a cup of coffee and staring toward the horizon. Because the world wanted a headline, but he just wanted her back. The backlash came swiftly, as it always does when power dares to look human. At first, the headlines were romantic, glossy, soft around the edges. The world loved the image of a billionaire in boots, a mysterious farmer, a life traded for simplicity. But admiration has a short shelf life, especially when money is involved. Some accused her of orchestrating it all, a calculated PR stunt to rebrand her legacy. Others painted Eli as a pawn, a prop in a narrative too perfect to be real. Articles shifted tone. Talk shows debated her mental state. Shareholders cried negligence. Her former fiancé, ever so wounded in public, told a camera he only wanted what was best for her. And still, Grace didn't flinch. She stayed quiet for 6 days, long enough to let the noise grow teeth. Then, without warning, she walked into the lobby of Whitmore Global's Manhattan headquarters, wearing boots caked with farm dirt and a denim jacket that still smelled faintly of hay. Cameras flashed. Security tried to intervene. She didn't pause. In the boardroom, on live stream no less, she stood before the men and women who had once dictated her every move and did what no one expected. She didn't defend herself. She didn't explain the river or the barn or the man who fixed fences in silence. She simply said, "I built this company, and now I'm giving it away." There was stunned silence. And then she clarified. She was liquidating her personal holdings, transferring a portion to social entrepreneurship programs, stepping away from the board permanently, and using the remainder to establish the Whitmore Rural Renewal Fund. "Starting," she said, her voice steady, "with the county where I remembered who I was." She didn't name Eli, not once, but she didn't have to. The fund launched within a week. Grants for farmers, microloans for local businesses, scholarships for students who'd never seen a trust fund but knew the value of sweat. She turned the frenzy into fuel and aimed it at healing something deeper than her reputation. And while the world buzzed about legacy, redemption, and the strange poetry of it all, Grace stepped off the stage, turned her phone off, and pointed herself toward home. Winter arrived quiet and hard, blanketing Maplewood in silence. The river froze at the edges, its soft trickle muted beneath a crust of ice. Eli moved slower these days, not because of age, but because everything felt heavier without her. He still fed the animals, still fixed the fence that never seemed to stay whole, but something was missing in the spaces between. It had been weeks since her public resignation, weeks since the fund bearing her family name began quietly transforming the lives of people around him. Still, no word, no calls, just headlines, and her silence. Until the morning she came back. He was walking the path by the river when he saw her, standing exactly where he'd found her months ago. Her coat was dusted in snow, hair pulled back beneath a wool hat, cheeks flushed red with cold. She didn't speak when he approached, just looked up, eyes shining like the river behind her, frozen but not lifeless. "I didn't want to send a letter," she said. "Not this time." Eli stopped a few feet away. "You really came back." "I said I would," she whispered. They stood there, the frost between them evaporating into breath. "I watched the sunrise every morning," she said, "thinking of this river, thinking of you, wondering if I'd already used up my one miracle." Eli looked at her. No headlines, no cameras, no glamour, just the girl from the photo, the woman who remembered what it meant to feel safe. "I don't have much," he said quietly. "Just this land, this life." She stepped closer. "You have more than most. You stayed. You stayed when everything tried to tear you apart. That's rare, Eli." He reached into his coat pocket, pulling out the folded photo she'd left behind, the two of them as children forever paused in muddy joy. "I carried this every day," he said. She smiled, tears catching in her lashes. "Do you still believe in second chances?" He didn't speak. He just took her hand, and beside the frozen river he said the only words that mattered. "Yes, especially the kind that come back on their own." The snow had barely melted when Eli led her up the hill behind the orchard, past the old stone wall and the leaning cedar that still bore the initials of half the county carved into its bark. The ground was soft beneath their boots, the air clean in that way it only gets after winter lets go. Grace didn't ask where they were going, just followed, trusting the quiet purpose in his stride. At the top of the hill, where the trees thinned and the sunlight pooled warm across the earth, he stopped and knelt, not to her, to the ground. She watched as he pushed back a patch of soil, his hands bare despite the lingering chill. He dug slowly, with care, like the earth was holding something sacred. And when he finally hit the glass, he paused, his fingers brushing dirt from the top of an old mason jar, the word someday scratched into the lid with a dull pocket knife. Grace's breath caught. He opened it, revealing its time-worn contents: 2 bottle caps, a folded comic book page, a broken slingshot string, and a small rusted locket, the camp locket. The one she'd worn every day that summer, the one he'd teased her for calling magic, the one they'd buried, promising to dig up someday when life made more sense, when they were braver. He held it out, palms open. "I didn't buy a ring," Eli said. "Didn't feel right, putting a price on something that's always been yours." Grace knelt beside him, eyes locked on the locket as he opened it gently. Inside, 2 tiny photos cut from that old camp picture, her on the left, him on the right. "I've loved you since before I knew what love was," he said, voice barely louder than the wind, "and I've waited longer than I realized to ask." He looked up at her. "So, Grace Whitmore, would you marry me?" She didn't cry, not right away. She just laughed softly, like something long held had finally broken free. Then she nodded, pressing her forehead to his. "Yes," she whispered, "1,000 times, yes." And there on that hill where someday once lived, 2 hearts found the day they had waited for all along. Spring came, early the year they started over. Not the kind of spring that tiptoes in quietly, but the kind that announces itself, bold green shoots pushing through soil, blossoms bursting open like held breath, the sun warmer than it should be in April. The land responded like it had been waiting too, like it sensed something had shifted, or returned. Grace didn't move into the house right away. She moved into the days. Early mornings, feed runs, barn repairs. She learned how to fix a fence without cursing, how to spot a sick goat before it stumbled, how to drive the tractor with one hand and wave to a neighbor with the other. And Eli, he learned how to let someone in, not just onto the farm, but into the rhythm. They rebuilt everything together. The barn got a new roof. The greenhouse, once half collapsed, now gleamed with glass panels and rows of budding vegetables. The old equipment shed was turned into a reading nook for local kids who came on field trips, because Grace insisted children needed to know how food grew and where trust was planted. With her funds and his roots, they turned the place into more than a farm. It became a story, the kind people drove miles to visit. And every visitor, whether they came for the goats or the apple pie or just to meet the woman who once walked away from an empire, left with a small mason jar in hand. Inside each jar, a handful of heirloom seeds, no label, just a tag tied with twine, marked with one word in Eli's careful script: someday. Grace said it was for the dreamers, for the kids who didn't know yet what they wanted, only that it would be real. For the grown-ups who forgot they could begin again. For the ones who needed something small to hold on to while they figured everything else out. And when she walked the fields now, boots muddy, hands strong, laughter loud, people no longer whispered her name like it was too big for the valley. Because this wasn't the place she ran to. This was the place that grew her back. It happened just after sunrise, the sky still pink with sleep, and the barn still quiet except for the soft shuffle of hooves and straw. Grace had been the first to notice. Buttercup wasn't her usual bossy self. Instead of chasing chickens or nibbling on Eli's pant leg, she'd tucked herself into the farthest stall, breathing slow, eyes half closed, like she was listening to something only she could hear. Grace called Eli in a whisper that still somehow carried urgency. By the time they reached her, Buttercup was lying in a bed of fresh hay, belly heaving, tiny cries already breaking through the air. Eli moved fast, steady hands, calm voice, while Grace crouched beside him, biting her lip and holding her breath like a nervous ant in a waiting room. And then, just like that, they arrived. Two tiny perfect kids, damp and trembling, all legs and squeaks in miracle. Grace laughed, a sound that filled the barn like music. "We've got twins." Eli smiled as he gently dried them off, one in each hand. Looks like Buttercup was hiding more than attitude. They watched as the babies wobbled to their feet, leaning into their mother, their bleats still unsure. Grace reached out to the smaller one, white with a little black patch over one eye. "This one. She's got fight in her." Eli nodded, brushing straw from her shoulder. "What are you thinking for names?" Grace tilted her head, thoughtful. "Well, you once told me patience was something worth learning." "Still is," he said. "Then we'll call this little rebel Patience." Eli turned to the other, slightly bigger, calm, resting against Buttercup like she already understood the world. "And her?" Grace smiled, quiet and full. "Grace Jr., maybe she'll live a life with a little less running." Eli reached for her hand, squeezing it gently. "Or maybe she'll run toward the right things from the start." They stayed there a long time, just watching. No headlines, no noise, just new life, straw, and warmth shared between them. And outside the world began again, just a little softer, just a little fuller. Because even the smallest lives carry the biggest reminders. Some beginnings are born in barns, and some love stories have 4 hooves and a name that echoes. The classroom smelled like dry erase markers and glue sticks, and the buzz of restless energy hummed beneath the surface like a current. Grace stood at the front, boots scuffed from the morning's chores, her sleeves rolled up and her voice soft, steady. The teacher had introduced her formally. Grace Whitmore, former CEO, philanthropist, founder of the Whitmore Rural Renewal Fund. But the kids didn't care about titles. They cared about the story. And Grace knew how to tell it. She started not with success, but with the river. "When I was a little girl," she said, "I fell into the winding river. I thought I could cross it like the older kids. I was wrong." Eyes widened. Small hands gripped desk edges. "I remember the cold, the panic, but mostly I remember a boy." She paused, letting the weight of it settle. "He was just a kid like me, muddy, scrappy, quiet. But when everyone else froze, he moved. He jumped in, pulled me out. He didn't wait to be asked." She held up the photo, creased, worn, the same one that lived in her chest pocket and her soul. "That's him. That's Eli." Some of the kids smiled. One girl whispered, "He looks nice." Grace laughed softly. "He was. He still is." Then her voice lowered, tender and true. "I went on to do all the things adults say matter. College, company, wealth. But years later, when my life felt like it was sinking again, I remembered him, not the headlines, not the boardroom, just the boy who didn't hesitate to be kind." She glanced toward the window where the sun filtered through, warm, gentle, like memory. "He saved me twice, once from drowning, and once when I didn't even know I needed saving." A little boy in the front raised his hand. "Did you marry him?" She smiled, proud and quiet. "I did." There were giggles, a few claps, and before she left she handed each child a tiny jar filled with heirloom seeds. Tied around each one was a tag with a single word, "Someday." And the story of the boy who stayed found a new generation ready to believe in the quiet power of kindness. Because some stories don't end. They just get replanted. The river hadn't changed much, not really. The rocks still jutted out along the bend. The sycamore roots still tangled like sleeping snakes at the edge of the trail, and the water still whispered the same slow secrets it always had. But now there was a wooden sign at the start of the path. The Someday Trail, in honor of kindness that stays. Grace walked it slowly, hand in hand with her daughter, a wide-eyed little girl in denim overalls and a braid trailing down her back. She was 7 now, curious, stubborn, always asking why the sun rises and how goats have babies. And Grace answered every question with the kind of patience she never had before this life. They reached the bend just as the wind picked up, rustling the trees in soft applause. The same rock was still there, the one where Grace had once sat, crying with a photo in her lap, and hope clinging to the edges of a long-lost memory. She stepped onto it now, pulling her daughter gently to her side. "Right here," she said, her voice softer than the wind. "This is where I found forever." The little girl tilted her head. "What do you mean?" Grace knelt, brushing the girl's hair behind her ear. "I came here when I didn't know who I was anymore. I'd lost everything I thought mattered. But then I found someone who saw the best in me when I couldn't see it myself." Her daughter looked up. "Daddy?" Grace smiled, tears glinting but never falling. "Yes, Daddy." She turned her gaze back to the water, the current slow, steady, timeless. "He saved me without asking for anything in return. He didn't fix me. He reminded me I didn't need to be fixed. Just loved. Just seen." The little girl reached for a pebble and tossed it into the river, watching the ripples widen. "I think the river remembers." "I think so too," Grace whispered. They stood there in the hush, side by side, one hand holding legacy, the other holding future. And for the first time in a long time, Grace didn't just feel grateful. She felt home,